Welcome back to channel. Today we drift into the fascinating and sometimes bizarre world of the 1950s, exploring the weirdest etiquette rules that housewives had to follow. From perfectly timed dinners to flawless hosting and unspoken social expectations, we're uncovering the surprising realities behind the polished smiles of the era. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more history deep dives, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a video. Close your eyes for a moment and picture the perfect American neighborhood in the 1950s. The lawns are trimmed with military precision, the sidewalks are clean, the curtains in every window are neatly pressed. A pastel-colored car glides into a driveway as children ride bicycles in slow circles under the watchful eye of their mothers. Inside each home, dinner simmers gently on the stove, the scent of roast beef, fresh bread, or apple pie floats through the air. And standing in the center of this carefully arranged world is the smiling housewife dressed in a crisp cotton dress. A string of pearls resting gently at her collarbone, her lipstick perfectly applied, her hair styled in soft waves. This is the image that has survived in photographs, television reruns, and nostalgia-driven documentaries. It is an image of stability, warmth, and domestic bliss. It is often described as a simpler time, a golden age of family life. But like most golden images, it was polished until it gleamed. Behind that shine was an invisible structure of expectations, rules, and social pressures that shaped millions of women's daily lives. The 1950s were born out of relief and exhaustion. World War II had ended in 1945, leaving behind a world desperate for normalcy. Soldiers returned home, industries shifted back to peacetime production, and governments encouraged stability above all else. In the United States especially, there was a powerful cultural push toward rebuilding family life. Suburbs expanded rapidly. Housing developments like Levittown offered affordable homes to returning veterans. The nuclear family, father as breadwinner, mother as homemaker, children as symbols of hope, became the model of success. But this model did not simply emerge naturally. It was carefully promoted. Magazines filled their pages with smiling women holding vacuum cleaners and casserole dishes. Advertisements portrayed kitchen appliances as tools of liberation, promising women more free time, though that free time was usually redirected into making the home even more perfect. Women's magazines offered step-by-step instructions on how to maintain a happy marriage, raise polite children, decorate a welcoming living room, and even greet a husband properly at the door. One influential voice in this culture of domestic guidance was Helen Andelin, whose book Fascinating Womanhood encouraged women to embrace traditional femininity and male leadership within marriage. The message was clear: a woman's greatest power lay not in independence, but in her ability to inspire, support, and serve her husband. While not every woman read her book, the themes she promoted echoed throughout advice columns and social expectations of the era. To understand why these expectations became so strong, we have to look at the broader cultural climate. The Cold War was beginning. Tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union created a constant undercurrent of fear. In this atmosphere, the stable American family was presented as proof of moral superiority. A happy home became a symbol of national strength. Domestic order reflected political order. In a world threatened by nuclear anxiety and ideological conflict, the tidy suburban household represented safety. And at the heart of that household stood the housewife. Her role was not considered small. On the contrary, it was framed as essential. She was described as the emotional center of the home, the moral guide for her children, the support system for her husband. But with that importance came intense scrutiny. If the children misbehaved, it reflected on her. If the house was messy, it reflected on her. If the marriage faltered, it reflected on her. The pressure to be perfect was not always loud or aggressive. Often it was subtle, woven into daily life. A neighbor's raised eyebrow at unkempt hair, a relative's comment about a slightly overcooked roast, a magazine article warning that men might stray if they felt unappreciated. The message repeated itself in countless small ways. A good wife maintains harmony. A good wife looks pleasant. A good wife does not complain. This ideal was also reinforced by television, a relatively new but rapidly growing influence. Family sitcoms presented cheerful mothers who solved problems within 30 minutes, all while wearing dresses and heels inside their own homes. The conflicts were mild, the endings were neat. The mother's patience seemed limitless. For viewers, these shows did not necessarily dictate behavior outright, but they created a benchmark, an image to measure oneself against. It is important to remember that during World War II, millions of women had worked outside the home. They built airplanes, welded ships, assembled ammunition. Rosie the Riveter became a cultural icon representing female strength and industrial contribution. But when the war ended and men returned, many women were encouraged and sometimes pressured to leave those jobs. Society shifted its praise from the working woman to the domestic woman. The hero of wartime became the homemaker of peacetime. This transition was not seamless for everyone. Some women were happy to focus on family life. Others missed the independence and camaraderie of the workplace. But open dissatisfaction was rarely encouraged. Gratitude was the expected response. After years of war, wasn't peace enough? Wasn't a safe home something to celebrate? So the image solidified. The 1950s housewife is the guardian of comfort and calm. Yet maintaining that calm required constant labor, physical and emotional. Without modern conveniences like dishwashers in every home or microwave ovens, household tasks were time-consuming. Laundry involved sorting, washing, hanging, ironing. Meals were often prepared from scratch. Floors were scrubbed by hand. Children's clothes were mended rather than replaced. Even with new appliances advertised as miraculous time savers, expectations for cleanliness and presentation increased alongside them. A spotless home was not just desirable, it was expected. There was also an unspoken performance element to daily life. The front yard had to appear welcoming. Curtains had to hang just right. When neighbors visited, coffee and cake should be ready. The house became a stage on which competence and femininity were constantly displayed. Social gatherings amplified this performance. Dinner parties were opportunities to demonstrate culinary skill and gracious hosting. Women exchanged recipes, decorating tips, and parenting advice. Beneath the friendliness, comparisons sometimes simmered. Whose home was more stylish? Whose children were more polite? Whose husband seemed most content? In this environment, self-doubt could grow quietly. If reality did not match the ideal, if a woman felt tired, restless, or unfulfilled, she might assume the problem lay within herself rather than within the expectations surrounding her. After all, every magazine cover seemed to suggest that happiness was simple. Keep your husband satisfied, keep your house clean, keep your children well behaved. Smile. The smile became almost symbolic of the era. It appeared in advertisements, family photographs, and television shows. It suggested that everything was under control. It reassured neighbors that all was well. But human emotions are rarely so tidy. Behind some of those smiles were women struggling with isolation. Suburban neighborhoods, though picturesque, could be lonely during the day when husbands were at work and children were at school. Extended families often lived far away. Mental health discussions were limited, and therapy was not widely normalized for everyday dissatisfaction. And yet many women also built strong friendships with one another. They formed community groups, church circles, book clubs. They supported each other through pregnancies, illnesses, and financial challenges. The 1950s housewife was not simply a passive figure. She managed budgets, scheduled appointments, negotiated with salesmen, organized school events, and navigated complex social networks. Still, the boundaries of acceptable ambition were narrow. Expressing a desire for a career, advanced education, or a life beyond domesticity could invite criticism. Ambition had to be carefully framed, perhaps as a hobby, perhaps as volunteer work, but rarely as an equal alternative to homemaking. This is where the tension of the era begins to show. On the surface, everything appeared orderly. Beneath the surface, questions were quietly forming. What if fulfillment required more than a spotless kitchen? What if intelligence and creativity sought outlets beyond decorating and dinner planning? These questions would grow louder in the decades that followed. But in the early and mid-1950s, conformity was powerful. The fear of standing out, of being labeled difficult, ungrateful, or unfeminine kept many women aligned with expectations. When we look back at the 1950s today, nostalgia often smooths over these complexities. Vintage advertisements feel charming. Retro fashion feels elegant. The image of family dinners around a table feels comforting. And there is truth in that comfort. Many families did experience love, laughter, and genuine closeness. The era was not a monolith of misery or repression, but it was structured by unwritten rules about gender roles, structured by cultural messaging about happiness, structured by the belief that domestic perfection equaled personal worth. Understanding this structure does not mean judging it harshly. It means recognizing that every historical period carries its own expectations that shape daily life in ways both visible and invisible. The 1950s housewife was not simply a stereotype. She was a real woman navigating a real set of circumstances. Some embraced those circumstances wholeheartedly. Some felt constrained by them. Most likely experienced a mixture of pride, frustration, joy, and exhaustion, sometimes all in the same day. And that is where our exploration truly begins. Because before we examine the specific etiquette rules, before we talk about makeup at breakfast, tables or silent dinners prepared on schedule, we must understand the world that produced them. A world recovering from war, a world craving stability, a world that believed order at home reflected order in society. In that world, the housewife was more than a homemaker. She was a symbol of national prosperity, a symbol of moral clarity, a symbol of success. And symbols, as history repeatedly shows us, are rarely allowed to be imperfect. If there was one rule that captured the spirit of 1950s domestic life more than any other, it was this: always look perfect, not occasionally, not when guests arrived, not only for church on Sunday, always. The expectation began the moment a woman opened her eyes in the morning. Advice columns and homemaking guides often suggested that a good wife should rise before her husband. The reasoning was simple but revealing. He should never see her in a state of disarray. Before he entered the kitchen for breakfast, she was expected to have brushed her hair, applied light makeup, and changed out of her nightclothes. Even if she had woken up exhausted from tending to a sick child in the night, the outward presentation needed to suggest freshness and calm. The morning ritual was not framed as vanity, it was framed as respect. Lipstick was frequently described as essential. A touch of rouge, neatly powdered skin, carefully shaped eyebrows, these details were portrayed as small gestures that communicated care and attentiveness. Women's magazines suggested that neglecting one's appearance could signal indifference toward a husband. Beauty was not merely personal, it was relational. Hair in particular carried enormous symbolic weight. Styles in the 1950s were deliberate and structured. Soft curls, carefully set waves, or neat updos. Many women slept in rollers to maintain these looks, though they were advised not to be seen wearing them at the breakfast table. Curlers, face creams, and cold cream masks belonged behind closed doors. The transformation from private preparation to public presentation was meant to be seamless. The message was clear. Effort should be invisible. A husband might understand that maintaining a home required work, but he was not meant to witness the labor behind feminine beauty. Just as a well-prepared meal appeared effortlessly on the table, so too was a wife's appearance meant to look naturally polished. Clothing followed the same principle. House dresses were common, practical, yet designed to maintain a flattering silhouette. Aprons were often worn not only to protect clothing but to enhance the domestic image. Even while vacuuming or dusting, a woman was expected to look put together. Pants for women were not entirely unheard of, but dresses and skirts dominated daily life, reinforcing a clear visual distinction between male and female roles. High heels were sometimes worn inside the home, particularly when expecting company, or when a husband was due to return from work. The idea of greeting him barefoot or in worn-out slippers conflicted with the era's ideal of continuous presentation. Why such emphasis on appearance? Part of the answer lies in the economic and cultural boom of post-war America. Consumer culture flourished. Cosmetic companies expanded rapidly, marketing beauty products as tools of empowerment and marital harmony. Advertisements often hinted subtly or directly that maintaining attractiveness was a wife's responsibility. A tidy home and an attractive spouse became twin symbols of a successful man. In this sense, a woman's appearance was tied to her husband's social standing. If she appeared disheveled, neighbors might assume that something was wrong in the marriage. If she gained weight or neglected grooming, gossip could follow. In tight-knit suburban communities, perception mattered deeply. Keeping up appearances was not simply about pride, it was about social security. There was also a psychological dimension. After years of wartime anxiety, order and beauty felt stabilizing. A carefully dressed woman in a tidy kitchen represented control in a world that had recently felt chaotic. The domestic sphere became a canvas upon which normalcy was painted, and the housewife herself was part of that composition. But maintaining that image required constant vigilance. Makeup routines had to be learned and refined. Magazines provided tutorials on achieving the natural look, which paradoxically often required multiple products. Lipstick shades were carefully chosen to complement outfits. Nail polish needed to match. Even eyebrows became subjects of discussion. Too thin or too thick could disrupt the desired balance of femininity. Weight was another silent pressure. Slenderness was idealized. Diet tips appeared regularly in women's publications. The goal was not athleticism but controlled elegance, a figure that fit neatly into tailored dresses and projected youthfulness. Aging, of course, was inevitable, but it was treated almost as a private challenge. Gray hairs were dyed, wrinkles were softened with creams. A wife was encouraged to maintain her attractiveness as a way of sustaining romance within marriage. The implication was rarely stated bluntly, but it hovered in the background. If a husband lost interest, a wife might be blamed for letting herself go. This burden of responsibility shaped daily routines in subtle ways. Consider the rhythm of an ordinary weekday. A woman might wake before dawn, prepare herself quietly, and begin breakfast preparations. She would ensure her children were dressed neatly before school. She would clear the table, wash dishes, make beds with tight hospital corners, and begin cleaning tasks, all while maintaining her own presentable appearance. Sweat, fatigue, and frustration had no visible place in this choreography. Even leisure carried expectations. If she visited a friend for coffee, her outfit should be appropriate. If she went grocery shopping, she was not simply running errands, she was representing her household. The supermarket aisle could become a social space where other women observed one another. Presentation mattered everywhere. Yet this emphasis on appearance was not entirely imposed from above. Many women took pride in it. Dressing well could feel empowering. Mastering hairstyling techniques could feel creative. Sharing beauty tips fostered community bonds. The ritual of preparation could offer a sense of identity in a role that sometimes felt repetitive. The complexity lies in the balance between choice and pressure. For some women, the expectation to look perfect was embraced willingly. For others, it felt exhausting, an additional layer of labor on top of already demanding responsibilities. And it was labor. Applying makeup daily, maintaining styled hair, ironing dresses, and preserving an immaculate wardrobe required time and resources. Clothing had to be laundered carefully. Fabric wrinkles need smoothing. Shoes had to be polished. Stockings could tear easily and required replacement. The financial dimension cannot be ignored. Cosmetics and fashionable clothing cost money. In households with limited income, maintaining the ideal image could strain budgets. Yet social pressure did not diminish for those with fewer resources. There was also an emotional component to constant presentation. When appearance becomes a measure of worth, self-perception can become fragile. A bad hair day could feel like a personal failure. Weight gain could feel like moral weakness. The mirror became not just a tool of grooming but a silent judge. This constant self-monitoring aligned with broader cultural themes of conformity. The 1950s valued sameness, similar homes, similar routines, similar family structures. Standing out too much could invite scrutiny. In fashion and beauty, trends created cohesion. Red lipstick, defined waists, soft curls, these became visual markers of belonging. To deviate significantly was to risk being labeled unconventional. Yet within these constraints, individuality still flickered. Some women experimented with bolder lipstick shades. Some embraced shorter hairstyles. Some quietly adopted more practical clothing at home despite social expectations. Personal agency never disappeared entirely, it adapted. Another layer of complexity emerged in how appearance intersected with race and class. The idealized image promoted in mainstream media was overwhelmingly white and middle class. Women of color often navigated additional barriers and pressures, balancing cultural expectations within their communities alongside broader societal standards. The perfect housewife image was not universally accessible, yet its influence extended widely. Returning to the central rule, always look perfect, we see that it functioned as more than aesthetic guidance. It reinforced a hierarchy within marriage. If the husband's role was to work outside the home and provide financially, the wife's visible contribution was beauty and order. Her polished appearance symbolized gratitude and devotion. The house became her domain. Her body, in a sense, became part of the daycare. When a husband returned home after work, the expectation was that he would be greeted by calm surroundings and a pleasant-looking spouse. The greeting itself was almost ceremonial, a warm smile, a gentle tone of voice, perhaps a quick touch-up of lipstick just before he walked through the door. The transformation from daytime labor to evening composure had to be swift. Children, too, absorbed these visual cues. Daughters watched their mother's routines and learned that femininity involved preparation and presentation. Sons learned to associate domestic harmony with polished appearance. Cultural norms reproduced themselves quietly in these everyday scenes. Yet beneath the lipstick and pressed dresses were human beings with complex inner lives. Fatigue did not disappear because mascara was applied. Frustration did not vanish because hair was perfectly curled. The discipline of appearance sometimes functioned as armor, a way to maintain dignity and composure even when emotions felt turbulent. In some cases, that armor became heavy. The requirement to conceal stress could isolate women from one another. If every neighbor appeared flawless, admitting struggle felt risky. Conversations might remain light, focused on recipes and decor rather than deeper dissatisfaction. The surface shimmered, the depths remained hidden. Still, it would be too simple to portray this entire culture of appearance as oppressive without nuance. Beauty rituals can also be sources of joy, creativity, and confidence. Many women genuinely enjoyed dressing well and expressing themselves through fashion. The 1950s produced iconic silhouettes and glamorous styles that continue to inspire designers today. The key difference lies in expectation versus choice. When looking polished is a voluntary expression of identity, it can feel liberating. When it is treated as a moral obligation, a measure of one's value as a wife, it can feel restrictive. The 1950s blurred that line. As the decade progressed, cracks slowly began to appear in the facade. Some women questioned why their worth seemed so closely tied to lipstick and laundry. Some pursued education quietly. Some entered the workforce part-time. The seeds of future change were being planted, even as the dominant image remained intact. But during the height of the era, the rule stood firm. Always look perfect. It was a rule that shaped mornings, influenced budgets, structured social interactions, and defined marital rituals. It transformed private grooming into public performance. It turned beauty into responsibility. And perhaps most tellingly, it required women to maintain that polished image not only for others but for themselves. Over time, external expectations can become internal standards. A woman might glance at her reflection not because someone demanded it, but because she had learned to demand it of herself. That is how cultural norms sustain themselves, not only through enforcement, but through internalization. So when we picture the 1950s housewife standing in her kitchen, pearls resting against her collarbone, lipstick freshly applied, we are seeing more than fashion. We are seeing the visible result of countless subtle messages about duty, respect, femininity, and worth. We are seeing discipline disguised as elegance, and behind that elegance was effort, quiet, constant, and rarely acknowledged as labor. The smile may have looked effortless, but perfection never is. There was a particular moment in the rhythm of a 1950s household that carried almost ceremonial importance: the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. For many housewives, the entire afternoon quietly built toward that sound. Advice columns, homemaking manuals, and popular women's magazines frequently emphasized what should happen next. A husband returning from work was not to step into chaos, noise, or visible exhaustion. He was to enter calm. He was to enter warmth. He was to enter a home that felt like a reward after the pressures of the outside world. And it was the wife's responsibility to create that transformation. Dinner, first and foremost, needed to be ready or nearly ready when he arrived. This did not mean casually beginning to cook when he walked through the door. It meant planning hours ahead. Meat defrosted in time, vegetables chopped and prepared, table set, serving dishes warmed. If the meal required precise timing, the final steps were orchestrated carefully so that everything reached the table at peak freshness. A hot dinner symbolized care. It symbolized order. It symbolized competence. Many household guides suggested beginning meal preparation early in the afternoon to avoid rushing. The implication was clear. A flustered wife suggested poor planning. A smooth, effortless presentation suggested devotion and skill. But food was only one element of the ritual. Children were often instructed to tidy themselves before their father arrived home. Faces washed, hands clean, toys put away, homework in progress or completed, noise levels lowered. In some advice columns, wives were encouraged to encourage quiet activities during the final half hour, before a husband's return, so that the house would feel peaceful rather than chaotic. The house itself required final inspection: cushions fluffed, newspapers stacked neatly, dishes cleared from countertops, floors swept, windows opened briefly for fresh air if weather allowed. The idea was not necessarily that the home had to be spotless at every moment of the day, though that was often implied, but that at the specific moment of his arrival, everything should feel in control. And then there was the wife herself. If she had been cleaning all afternoon, she might need to change into a fresh dress. If she had been cooking, she might need to reapply lipstick. A quick glance in the mirror ensured that fatigue was not too visible. Even posture mattered. Standing upright rather than slouching. Greeting him with a smile rather than a sigh. The greeting itself was frequently described in near-scripted language. Offer a warm welcome. Ask about his day. Listen attentively. Avoid overwhelming him with complaints the moment he enters. Some guides went so far as to suggest that if he seemed tired or irritable, a wife should not take it personally. Instead, she should interpret his mood as a sign of how hard he worked for the family. Her role was to soothe, not challenge. This ritual was not purely about courtesy. It reflected a deeper philosophy about gender roles in the 1950s. The husband was framed as the provider of the one who faced the competitive, demanding world of business. The home was described as his refuge, and the wife was positioned as its guardian. If the outside world was loud and harsh, the inside world needed to be soft and welcoming. The transition from public sphere to private sphere had to feel dramatic in its comfort. This expectation placed enormous emotional labor on women. Emotional labor, though rarely named at the time, involves managing not only one's own feelings, but also the feelings of others. A wife might have experienced her own stressful day, a sick child, a broken appliance, a tight budget, a disagreement with a neighbor. Yet she was encouraged to temporarily set aside her frustrations to prioritize her husband's state of mind. The unwritten hierarchy of stress was clear. His workplace challenges were often seen as weightier than her domestic ones. Consider the symbolism embedded in this arrangement. His day was external, visible, economically measurable. Hers was internal, repetitive, and unpaid. When he returned home, the visible marker of his labor might be a briefcase or a paycheck. The visible marker of hers was a tidy room and a hot meal. Because domestic work lacked wages, its value was often measured through presentation. If dinner was late, it might appear that the day had not been managed properly. If children were noisy, it could signal insufficient discipline. If the house looked cluttered, it might suggest laziness. This created a quiet but persistent pressure to maintain standards that were sometimes unrealistic. Timing dinner perfectly was not always simple. Cooking technology was less advanced than today. Ovens varied in temperature accuracy. Fresh ingredients required preparation from scratch. Meals were often heavier and more elaborate than modern quick dinners, roasts, casseroles, layered desserts. Achieving perfect timing required practice, experience, and sometimes trial and error. Yet the cultural narrative rarely highlighted the complexity of this labor. Instead, advertisements depicted smiling women lifting casserole dishes effortlessly from ovens, as though culinary success were automatic. The same pattern applied to emotional atmosphere. If a husband entered a tense environment, perhaps children arguing or dishes clattering, the wife might feel that she had failed in her duty to create serenity. Even natural, everyday household noise could be interpreted through the lens of expectation. Of course, not every household operated with strict adherence to these ideals. Some families were more relaxed. Some husbands did not expect ceremony. Some couples shared humor and spontaneity at the door rather than ritualized calm. But the cultural script existed, and even when not followed exactly, it shaped assumptions. The power of a script lies not only in enforcement but in aspiration. A woman might feel compelled to approximate the ideal even if she could not fully achieve it. She might compare herself to neighbors or television portrayals and adjust her behavior accordingly. Television shows reinforced this evening ritual subtly. In family sitcoms of the era, fathers often returned home to affectionate greetings and well-prepared dinners. Conflicts, if present, were resolved gently by the end of the episode. Rarely did audiences see a mother overwhelmed at the exact moment her husband entered the house. The narrative maintained the illusion of smooth transitions. This pattern also reinforced authority structures within marriage. If the husband's return was treated as an event requiring preparation, it elevated his status within the household. He was the figure around whom the evening revolved. His mood could influence the tone of the night. His fatigue was prioritized. In some advice manuals, wives were instructed not to burden husbands immediately with household problems. Financial concerns, appliance malfunctions, school issues, these were to be introduced carefully, perhaps after dinner when he had relaxed. The implication was that his mind needed protection from overload. This guidance may have been intended as kindness, but it also subtly discouraged equal partnership in problem solving. The dinner table itself became a stage for family dynamics. Meals were expected to be orderly. Children were taught table manners. Conversation was often guided by the father's interests. A wife might facilitate dialogue but was encouraged not to dominate it. Again, nuance matters. Many families genuinely enjoyed these dinners. Shared meals fostered connection. Structured evenings provided stability. Ritual can be comforting. The issue lies in rigidity. When the expectation becomes inflexible, when deviation invites criticism, ritual shifts from comfort to constraint. For example, what if a wife was ill? Would she feel guilty for not preparing dinner on time? What if a child required urgent attention just as cooking needed supervision? What if she simply felt exhausted? The cultural messaging left limited space for imperfection. Another layer of complexity involved class differences. Middle-class suburban families were often the primary audience for these domestic ideals. Working-class families might have faced different realities, including women who worked outside the home out of necessity. In such households, the timing and presentation of dinner could be shaped more by practicality than performance. Yet even across economic lines, the symbolism of a wife welcoming her husband home remained powerful. There is also a broader historical context to consider. In earlier centuries, home and work were less sharply divided. Farms and small businesses blended domestic and economic spaces. The Industrial Revolution gradually separated workplace from household, and by the mid-20th century this separation was pronounced. The 1950s intensified the idea that men belonged in offices and women in kitchens. The evening reunion dramatized that division. He crossed from public sphere into private sanctuary. She remained within that sanctuary, maintaining it in his absence. This arrangement could foster intimacy, but it could also foster imbalance. Emotional labor once again sits at the center of this discussion. Listening attentively, offering encouragement, moderating children's behavior, maintaining composure, these tasks require psychological energy, yet because they leave no tangible product, they are easily overlooked. When a husband spoke about a difficult meeting or workplace tension, he was often encouraged to express frustration. When a wife experienced monotony or isolation, she was encouraged to endure quietly. Complaints risked appearing ungrateful. The expectation of silence around personal dissatisfaction is perhaps one of the most significant aspects of this rule. A woman might carefully curate her words during the evening. Rather than describing her own challenges first, she might ask about his. Rather than expressing irritation, she might soften her tone. Over time, this pattern could become habitual. Habits shape relationships. If one partner consistently manages atmosphere while the other consistently receives it, a dynamic forms that is difficult to rebalance. Yet again, it would be inaccurate to suggest that all husbands demanded this treatment. Many likely appreciated their wives' efforts and reciprocated in other ways. Some may have been unaware of the emotional choreography behind the scenes. Cultural expectations often operate invisibly, influencing behavior without explicit acknowledgement. The symbolism of the hot dinner and peaceful home also intersected with national identity. During the Cold War, American domestic life was often contrasted with perceived instability elsewhere. The well-fed, harmonious family became part of a broader narrative about prosperity and freedom. The suburban dinner table was not just a private scene, it was a cultural emblem. Within that emblem, the wife's role was central. Her success in preparing meals and maintaining calm was framed as contribution to national strength. Though she did not earn wages, her labor supported the breadwinner who participated in the economy. Her emotional management supported the father who embodied stability. This narrative elevated domesticity while simultaneously limiting its scope. It praised wives as essential yet confined them to narrow definitions of success. As the decade progressed, some women began to question these boundaries. The seeds of second-wave feminism were not yet fully visible, but dissatisfaction simmered quietly in some households. The ritual of greeting a husband at the door might feel comforting on some days and constricting on others. What makes this rule particularly revealing is how it blends kindness with control. Welcoming someone home warmly is a universal gesture of affection. Preparing a meal can be an expression of love. Listening to a partner's concerns is foundational to intimacy. But when these gestures become obligations tied to identity, when failure to perform them threatens one's status as a good wife, they transform. The 1950s ideal did not simply encourage warmth, it prescribed it. And prescriptions leave little room for deviation. Imagine the emotional landscape of a woman who tried her best each day to meet these standards. Some evenings likely felt rewarding: laughter around the table, compliments on a well-cooked roast, children sharing stories. Other evenings may have felt heavy fatigue masked by a smile, irritation swallowed before it surfaced. The car in the driveway signaled not only reunion but evaluation. Would dinner meet expectations? Would the house feel calm enough? Would her expression reflect patience rather than strain? Over time, this repeated moment could shape self-worth. Success at 6 p.m. might validate the day, a misstep might cast doubt over it. In examining this rule, we uncover more than culinary timing or polite greetings. We uncover a framework for understanding how gender roles were enacted daily, not through dramatic declarations, but through ordinary rituals repeated thousands of times. The evening return became a microcosm of the entire system: division of labor, emotional management, performance of femininity, and preservation of harmony. It is easy to romanticize the image: a family gathered around a table, candles flickering softly, father at the head, mother smiling beside him. And there is beauty in shared meals. But history invites us to look beyond the surface. Behind every perfectly timed dinner was planning. Behind every calm greeting was emotional calculation. Behind every peaceful evening was effort, visible and invisible. The rule that dinner must be ready when he walks through the door tells us not only about food, but about power, identity, and expectation. It tells us that domestic life in the 1950s was not accidental. It was structured, it was rehearsed, it was sustained by countless small acts of discipline, and like all structures built on expectation, it shaped the lives of those within it, sometimes gently, sometimes heavily, always persistently. In the carefully choreographed world of the 1950s home, entertaining guests was never a casual afterthought. It was an event. It was a performance. It was, in many ways, an examination. When the doorbell rang, it did not simply announce visitors. It signaled that the household, and especially the woman who managed it, was about to be observed. Hospitality had always carried social significance, but in the post-war suburban boom of the 1950s, it became something even more layered. Neighborhoods were filled with families who had recently moved in, often young couples starting new lives in nearly identical houses. Social bonds were still forming. Reputations were still being shaped. And in this environment, the ability to host gracefully became a powerful form of social currency. A well-hosted dinner party or afternoon coffee could elevate a family's standing. A poorly managed one could quietly damage it. Women's magazines and homemaking guides offered detailed instructions on the art of entertaining. There were articles on table settings: where exactly to place the fork, how far the knife should sit from the plate, how to fold napkins into elegant shapes. There were suggested menus for different seasons and occasions. There were rules about when to light candles, how to arrange flowers, and even how to coordinate tablecloth colors with dishware. Nothing was random. The dining table became a stage, and every element on it was part of the set design. China patterns were chosen carefully. Crystal glasses were polished until they caught the light. Silverware was aligned precisely. Even salt and pepper shakers were expected to match the aesthetic. If guests were being served multiple courses, plates had to be swapped discreetly, without clatter or confusion. And at the center of it all stood the hostess. Her appearance mattered as much as the decor. She was expected to be elegant but not ostentatious, attentive but not intrusive. Her dress should complement the tone of the evening. Her hair should remain styled throughout the event. Her makeup should look fresh, even hours into the gathering. But beyond appearance, it was her demeanor that carried the greatest weight. She needed to anticipate needs before they were spoken. Refill glasses without interrupting conversation. Smooth over awkward silences with light topics. Introduce guests to one another in ways that sparked easy dialogue. If two personalities clashed, she was expected to gently redirect the atmosphere. In many ways, she functioned as a social conductor, guiding the rhythm of the evening without drawing too much attention to herself. The pressure to achieve this balance was immense. Hosting was not merely about kindness, it was about competence. A successful evening reflected positively on her husband's career and social connections. If his colleagues were impressed by the meal and atmosphere, it could strengthen professional relationships. The home thus became an extension of his workplace, and the wife became an informal ambassador. This blending of domestic and professional spheres amplified the stakes. Imagine the preparation leading up to such an event. Days before, menus would be planned carefully, ingredients purchased thoughtfully. Some dishes prepared in advance to reduce last-minute stress. The house cleaned thoroughly, not just surface tidying but deep cleaning. Baseboards wiped, bathrooms scrubbed, windows checked for smudges. Even scents were considered. The home should smell pleasant but not overpowering. Fresh flowers might be placed strategically. A pie might be baked shortly before guests arrived, filling the air with comforting warmth. Children, if present, were coached on behavior. They were often expected to greet guests politely and then occupy themselves quietly elsewhere unless specifically included in the gathering. Their manners reflected directly on their mother's effectiveness. The evening itself required stamina. Unlike a casual family dinner, a social gathering demanded sustained attentiveness. The hostess could not retreat into fatigue. She remained alert to shifting dynamics: who needed another serving, who seemed bored, who might appreciate a change of topic. If something went wrong, a dish overcooked, a glass broken, a guest arriving unexpectedly, she was expected to recover gracefully. Panic was not permitted to show. Composure was part of the performance. This expectation of grace under pressure reveals a deeper truth about 1950s etiquette. Control was valued above all: control of environment, control of emotion, control of impression. The polished surface of suburban life depended on the ability to maintain order, even when circumstances threatened to disrupt it. Television shows of the era reinforced this ideal subtly but powerfully. Programs like Leave It to Beaver and The Donna Red Show often portrayed mothers who handled social situations effortlessly. Guests were welcomed warmly. Dinners unfolded smoothly. Problems were resolved without visible strain. While these portrayals were fictional, they shaped expectations. They offered templates of behavior that real women could compare themselves against. Comparison, even when silent, can be powerful. If one neighbor hosted an especially elegant dinner party, others might feel compelled to match or surpass it. This subtle competition was rarely acknowledged openly, but it existed beneath polite smiles. Whose roast was more tender? Whose table setting is more creative? Whose conversation is more lively? In communities where many families shared similar incomes and lifestyles, small details became markers of distinction. And because women were primarily responsible for these details, their social identity became tied to hospitality. It is important to recognize that hospitality can be genuinely fulfilling. Many women enjoyed planning gatherings, experimenting with recipes, decorating tables. Social events provided opportunities for creativity and connection. They broke the monotony of routine. They allowed friendships to deepen. But the distinction between enjoyment and obligation is critical. When hosting becomes a measure of worth, when failure invites judgment, joy can shift into anxiety. Consider the emotional weight of knowing that your home is under scrutiny. Even if guests are kind, the awareness of being evaluated can create tension. A small imperfection might loom large in the hostess's mind, even if no one else notices. The concept of keeping up appearances extended beyond individual events. It shaped ongoing social interactions. Women were expected to return invitations promptly, send thank you notes, and remember details about previous gatherings. Social calendars could become intricate webs of obligation. Thank you notes in particular carried importance. Handwritten and prompt, they signaled gratitude and refinement. Neglecting them could be interpreted as poor manners. Etiquette books outlined rules for nearly every scenario: how to seek guests of varying status, how to handle unexpected arrivals, how to politely decline invitations without causing offense. The sheer volume of guidance suggests how seriously social behavior was taken. This seriousness reflected broader cultural values of conformity and stability. In a decade marked by Cold War tensions and rapid economic growth, predictability felt reassuring. Clear rules for social conduct reduced ambiguity. If everyone followed the same guidelines, interactions would remain smooth. But strict guidelines also limited spontaneity. A hostess might hesitate to experiment too boldly with decor or cuisine for fear of violating unspoken standards. Traditional recipes were safer than unusual ones. Neutral conversation topics were safer than controversial ones. Politics, religion, and finances were often considered inappropriate dinner table subjects. The goal was pleasantness, not debate. A successful evening ended with smiles and compliments, not disagreements. The hostess was often tasked with steering conversation away from sensitive areas. If a guest ventured into divisive territory, she might gently redirect attention to safer ground. This required not only tact but quick thinking. Again, emotional labor played a central role. While her husband might engage in animated conversation about work or sports, she monitored the overall atmosphere. If someone felt left out, she included them. If energy lagged, she introduced a new topic or served dessert to shift focus. Her contribution was subtle but essential. The physical layout of the home also influenced entertaining. Suburban houses were often designed with living rooms and dining rooms that facilitated gatherings. Furniture arrangement mattered. Seating needed to encourage conversation without crowding. Even lighting choices were significant. In that quiet aftermath, the hostess might finally exhale. Perhaps she felt pride, perhaps relief, perhaps exhaustion, perhaps all three at once. And in that mixture of emotion lies the true complexity of 1950s etiquette, a world where domestic spaces doubled as social arenas, where women carried the responsibility of impression, and where the simple act of inviting someone to dinner became a measure of identity. Not because hospitality itself was strange, but because perfection was expected. Another rule, quieter but just as powerful, shaped the daily life of many 1950s housewives: stay in your lane. Unlike the visible expectations about appearance or dinner timing, this rule was often unspoken. It did not always appear in bold print in magazines. It did not need to. It was woven into conversation, education, media, and social custom. It shaped what topics were considered appropriate, what ambitions were acceptable, and what boundaries were not to be crossed. To stay in your lane meant understanding the invisible borders of femininity and not stepping beyond them. In social settings, this often translates into conversation rules. Politics, business strategy, and financial negotiations were widely viewed as masculine domains. A woman could listen politely, perhaps ask light questions, but she was generally discouraged from dominating such discussions. Strong opinions, especially on controversial issues, risked being labeled unfeminine or argumentative. Pleasantness was prized. Agreeability was admired. If a dinner table conversation shifted toward world affairs or economic policy, the expectation was that the husband or male guests would lead. The wife might gently redirect toward safer territory, community events, children's achievements, recipes, vacations. Her conversational strength lay in maintaining harmony rather than asserting expertise. This division extended beyond social gatherings into the structure of marriage itself. Finances in many households were managed primarily by husbands. Wives might handle grocery budgets or household allowances, but major investments, property decisions, and long-term financial planning were often considered the husband's responsibility. Even in cases where women were highly capable of managing complex financial matters, cultural norms discouraged overt control. The language used in advice manuals reinforced this hierarchy. A husband was described as the head of the household, a wife was described as the heart. The metaphor sounded poetic, even flattering, but it carried implications about authority and direction. The head decides, the heart supports. Education patterns also reflected these boundaries. While women certainly attended college in the 1950s, higher education for women was frequently framed as preparation for better motherhood rather than career ambition. Degrees in teaching, nursing, or home economics were considered appropriate. Fields like engineering, law, or high-level business were less accessible and less encouraged. The assumption underlying these patterns was that a woman's primary identity would be wife and mother. Ambition, if expressed too openly, risked social backlash. This tension was particularly complex because the 1950s followed a period in which women had stepped into traditionally male roles during World War II. They had worked in factories, offices, and laboratories. They had proven competence in fields previously closed to them. But when the war ended and men returned home, societal messaging shifted dramatically. Women were encouraged, and in some cases pressured, to relinquish those roles and return to domestic life. The cultural narrative reframed domesticity as not merely acceptable but superior. A truly fulfilled woman, it suggested, did not crave professional recognition. She found meaning in supporting her husband's success and nurturing her children's growth. If she desired more, the implication was that something might be wrong either with her priorities or her gratitude. This is where the rule of staying in one's lane intersected with internal identity. When a culture consistently reinforces the idea that certain dreams are inappropriate, individuals may begin to police themselves. A woman who felt curious about politics might silence her questions. A woman who longed for a career in science might dismiss the idea as unrealistic. A woman who enjoyed intellectual debate might soften her tone to avoid appearing intimidating. Self-censorship can become habit. It is important to recognize that not all women accepted these boundaries passively. Some pursued careers quietly. Some negotiated more equal partnerships within marriage. Some expressed their opinions boldly despite criticism. But the prevailing cultural current flowed toward limitation. Media portrayals reinforced this current. Popular television shows rarely depicted wives as deeply engaged in political activism or corporate leadership. Instead, they were shown managing households, solving minor family dilemmas, and supporting their husbands' careers. Ambition outside the home was either minimized or framed as temporary. Even language choices reflected these norms. A woman described as strong-willed could carry a negative connotation. A man described the same way might be praised as decisive. Social approval functioned as enforcement. Neighbors, relatives, church communities all contributed to maintaining expectations. If a woman seemed too outspoken, whispers could circulate. If she devoted excessive time to personal projects at the expense of home duties, criticism might follow. The home was defined as her rightful domain. To neglect it was to neglect her identity. This framing created a powerful psychological bind. Because domestic success was linked to moral worth, pursuing external ambition could feel like betrayal. If she sought a career, was she failing her children? If she expressed frustration, was she ungrateful for stability? The internal conflict between personal aspiration and social expectation was rarely discussed openly. Instead, it simmered quietly. Religious teachings in some communities further reinforced gender roles. Sermons and church groups often emphasized male leadership within marriage and female submission or support. These teachings were not universal but were present. They strengthened the cultural script. Yet the rule of staying in one's lane was not limited to grand ambitions. It shaped everyday interactions. Consider how a wife might respond if she disagreed with her husband's opinion during a social gathering. Voicing strong opposition publicly could embarrass him, which in turn might reflect poorly on her. She might choose to wait until later to express her perspective privately, or she might choose not to express it at all. This pattern, repeated over years, could influence communication dynamics deeply. It is worth asking, what happens to creativity and intellect when consistently redirected? Some women channeled ambition into acceptable outlets. They became deeply involved in community organizations, school boards, church committees, and charitable groups. Within these spaces, they exercised leadership and organizational skill. These roles provided purpose and recognition, even if not formally acknowledged as careers. In fact, many grassroots movements of the 1960s would later be fueled by women who had honed their skills in these community settings. But in the 1950s, the boundaries remained firm. The rule of staying in one's lane also intersected with sexuality and personal autonomy. Conversations about reproductive choice, marital dissatisfaction, or emotional needs were limited. The expectation was that a wife adapted to her husband's desires rather than negotiating equally. Silence became a form of compliance. And yet, silence does not eliminate thought. Beneath composed exteriors, women reflected. They read. They discussed quietly with trusted friends. They questioned privately. Some found genuine fulfillment within the boundaries set for them. It is essential not to erase this reality. Many women took pride in nurturing families and creating stable homes. For them, staying within traditional roles did not feel restrictive but meaningful. The complexity lies in the absence of choice. When society presents one path as ideal and discourages alternatives, even voluntary decisions can be shaped by pressure. The concept of lane implies a roadway, a fixed direction with limited space for deviation. In the 1950s, the roadway for women was clearly marked: marriage, motherhood, domestic management, social grace. Stepping outside that lane required courage and often invited resistance. It is telling that the cultural shifts of the 1960s and 1970s would be described as liberation. Liberation implies prior confinement. The confinement was not always physical. It was social, conversational, psychological. The rule of staying in one's lane reveals how power can operate gently yet effectively. There were no widespread laws forbidding women from expressing opinions at dinner tables. There were no official decrees banning ambition. Instead, there were norms repeated, reinforced, internalized. Norms can be as binding as rules. Even fashion symbolized these lanes. Structured dresses, aprons, pearls, these visual cues communicated belonging. Women who dressed differently, spoke differently, or pursued unconventional interests risked appearing out of place. And belonging was precious in tightly knit suburban communities. There is also the factor of economic dependence. In many marriages, husbands were sole breadwinners. This financial arrangement could make challenging norms risky. Without independent income, a woman's security depended on the stability of her marriage. Openly defying expectations might threaten that stability. Thus, practicality reinforced conformity. Yet beneath the conformity, change was quietly brewing. Books like Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, published in the early 1960s, would later articulate what many women had felt but struggled to name: a sense of dissatisfaction despite outward comfort. Friedan described the problem that has no name, capturing the quiet restlessness that some housewives experienced. But in the height of the 1950s, that restlessness was often suppressed. The rule to avoid masculine conversations and ambitions reveals how identity was compartmentalized. Men occupied the public sphere of power, debate, and finance. Women occupied the private sphere of nurture, aesthetics, and emotional care. These spheres were presented as complementary, even equal in importance. Yet equality in rhetoric did not always translate to equality in agency. When we examine this rule historically, we see how cultural systems maintain themselves. They define appropriate behavior, reward compliance, and gently discourage deviation. They create stories about what fulfillment looks like. In the 1950s, the dominant story told women that true happiness lay in supporting others rather than pursuing independent authority. Some embraced that story wholeheartedly. Others quietly revised it in their own lives. The legacy of staying in one's lane extends beyond that decade. It invites reflection on how modern societies continue to define boundaries sometimes more subtly around gender, ambition, and expression. For the 1950s housewife, navigating these lanes required constant awareness. She measured her words. She evaluated her desires. She balanced curiosity with caution. And often, she did so with remarkable intelligence. Staying in one lane did not mean lacking depth, it meant containing it. It meant understanding the rules of the road and choosing, for reasons practical or personal, whether to follow them. In that choice, quiet or deliberate, lies the human complexity behind a simple phrase. Stay in your lane. 4 words that reveal not only etiquette, but the architecture of expectation itself. When we look back at the 1950s housewife, it is tempting to freeze her in a single frame. Pearls resting neatly at her collarbone, lipstick flawless, posture straight, dinner perfectly timed, children tidy and obedient. The image feels polished, almost cinematic. It carries a certain nostalgic glow, a promise of order in a world that often feels chaotic today. But history becomes far more meaningful when we step beyond the photograph. Beneath the smile was a person, and beneath the person was a complex web of expectations, negotiations, satisfactions, doubts, pride, and compromise. It is important to begin here. Not every woman of the 1950s felt trapped. Not every household operated under rigid rules. Not every marriage followed the cultural script to the letter. Human lives are always more varied than the ideals that attempt to define them. Many women genuinely loved homemaking. They found creativity in decorating, joy in cooking, purpose in raising children, and satisfaction in building community networks. For some, the post-war era offered stability that previous generations had lacked. After the Great Depression and World War II, predictability felt like a gift. Suburban life represented safety. Domestic routine felt grounding. For these women, the role of housewife was not a prison but a calling. Yet even within genuine contentment, complexity existed. The 1950s created a powerful myth of effortless happiness. Magazines, advertisements, and television rarely depicted exhaustion or dissatisfaction. They rarely showed the monotony that can accompany repetitive domestic tasks. They rarely acknowledged loneliness. Suburban neighborhoods, though visually vibrant, could be isolating during weekday hours. Husbands left for work early in the morning. Children left for school. The housewife remained. Silence filled the rooms. There were dishes to wash, floors to sweep, beds to make. There were errands to run, meals to plan, laundry to fold. But much of this labor occurred without adult companionship. Conversations with other women might happen occasionally over coffee, at church gatherings, during school events, but long stretches of the day could feel solitary. Isolation does not always announce itself loudly. It can slip in quietly between tasks. And because the cultural script insisted that domestic life was fulfilling, admitting loneliness could feel like failure. This tension between outward contentment and private complexity lies at the heart of understanding the era. Some women coped by forming tight-knit support networks. They shared recipes, childcare responsibilities, and emotional confidences. These friendships became lifelines. Within them, frustrations could be voiced more freely. Humor became a tool of survival. Shared understanding softened pressure. Others channeled energy into community involvement. They joined volunteer organizations, church committees, parent-teacher associations. In these spaces, they exercised leadership and organizational skill. They influenced local policies and built social capital, even if their contributions were rarely labeled as political power. Still, there were women who felt a quiet restlessness they could not easily name. They had comfortable homes. They had healthy children. They had husbands who provided financially. By every visible metric, they had succeeded. Yet something felt incomplete. This sense of incompleteness was not universal, but it was real for some. The problem was not that domestic work lacked value. It was that it was presented as the only valid source of value. When choice narrows, fulfillment can feel constrained. The cultural atmosphere of the 1950s made deviation difficult. Divorce carried significant stigma. Mental health discussions were limited. Career shifts for married women were often discouraged. If dissatisfaction emerged, it was frequently internalized rather than expressed. Some women interpreted their unease as personal weakness. They asked themselves, "Why am I not happier? Why do I feel ungrateful?" Others buried these questions beneath routine. Yet history shows us that buried questions do not disappear. They accumulate. As the 1960s approached, broader social changes began to stir. Civil rights movements gained momentum. Political activism increased. The feminist movement, though not yet at full volume, began to articulate the frustrations many women had quietly experienced. But in the height of the 1950s, the facade remained largely intact. The image of the contented housewife functioned almost as national propaganda. In the context of Cold War tensions, the stable nuclear family became a symbol of ideological superiority. Domestic happiness was not merely personal, it was patriotic. To challenge that image could feel subversive, yet beneath the patriotic glow were everyday negotiations. A wife might subtly influence household decisions through persuasion rather than authority. She might pursue education through night classes. She might take part-time work framed as supplemental rather than ambitious. Agency did not vanish, it adapted. When we talk about the 1950s housewife, we must avoid flattening her into a stereotype either as victim or as icon. She was neither exclusively oppressed nor universally content. She was human. Some marriages were genuinely collaborative and affectionate. Some husbands respected their wives' intelligence and encouraged growth. Some households shared responsibilities more evenly than cultural narratives suggest. At the same time, structural limitations were real. Legal and financial systems often disadvantaged women. Credit, property ownership, and career advancement were more accessible to men. Social expectations reinforced dependence. Within these constraints, women navigated daily life with resilience. Resilience often goes unnoticed because it does not always appear dramatic. It shows up in small acts, stretching a tight budget creatively, comforting a discouraged child, resolving neighborhood conflicts diplomatically, finding humor in repetitive tasks. It also appears in quiet rebellion, choosing to read books that challenge norms, encouraging daughters to pursue education, questioning assumptions privately. The seeds of social change are often planted in private conversations. When daughters of 1950s housewives came of age in the 1960s and 1970s, many carried both gratitude and critique. They appreciated stability but desired expanded opportunity. They witnessed their mother's strengths and sometimes their sacrifices. Generational shifts rarely happen in isolation. They grow from lived experience. It is also essential to recognize the diversity within the 1950s experience. The dominant cultural image centered on white, middle-class suburban families. Women of color, working-class women, and immigrant women often faced different realities. Many worked outside the home out of necessity. Their experiences complicate the nostalgic narrative. For some women, the ideal housewife image was unattainable from the start. Understanding this diversity prevents oversimplification. As we reflect on the etiquette rules explored earlier, perfect appearance, timed dinners, flawless hosting, staying within conversational lanes, we see how they formed a cohesive system. Each rule reinforced the others. Together they created a structure that shaped identity. But systems are sustained by people. And people interpret systems differently. Some embraced the structure as security. Others experienced it as confinement. Many felt both at different times. The smile of the 1950s housewife, therefore, cannot be interpreted at face value alone. It may reflect pride in a well-run home. It may conceal exhaustion. It may represent genuine joy in motherhood. It may hide unspoken questions. It may represent all of these simultaneously. When we examine history closely, we gain empathy. It becomes easy, from a modern perspective, to judge past norms harshly or to romanticize them uncritically. But the goal of historical reflection is neither condemnation nor blind nostalgia. It is understanding. Understanding how cultural forces shape personal lives. Understanding how ideals influence daily behavior. Understanding how individuals navigate systems that both support and limit them. The 1950s housewife stands at the intersection of these themes. She reminds us that social expectations are powerful but not absolute. That conformity can coexist with quiet resistance. that satisfaction can coexist with longing. As the 1960s unfolded, many women began to articulate what had previously remained private. The feminist movement did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from kitchens and living rooms, from whispered conversations and personal reflections. But even as change accelerated, many women continued to value domestic life deeply. The evolution of gender roles did not erase homemaking, it expanded the range of acceptable choices. And perhaps that is the most significant legacy of the 1950s housewife. She reveals the importance of choice. When domesticity is chosen freely, it can be fulfilling. When it is mandated by culture, it can feel restrictive. The distinction lies not in the tasks themselves, but in the freedom surrounding them. Looking back, we can see both the warmth and the weight of the era. We can see the pride in polished tables and well-tended gardens. We can see the discipline in perfectly timed dinners. We can see the grace in carefully managed conversations. We can also see the effort behind it all. History asks us to hold these truths together. The 1950s were not a fairy tale, nor were they a uniform nightmare. They were a complex chapter shaped by war recovery, economic expansion, cultural conservatism, and emerging change. And within that chapter lived millions of women, each with her own story. Some stories were loud, most were quiet. Some ended in lifelong domestic devotion. Others unfolded into activism, careers, and public leadership. When we look at that iconic image, the smiling woman in her apron, we are not seeing a caricature. We are seeing someone navigating her moment in history as best she could with the tools and expectations available to her. Her life was shaped by etiquette rules that now seem strange, but those rules tell us less about her limitations and more about the society that created them. They reveal a culture striving for order, projecting stability, and defining identity through gendered roles. And they remind us that behind every era's polished image lies human complexity. The strangest rules, perhaps, are not strange because they existed but because they were once unquestioned. Today we can question them, we can analyze them, we can learn from them, but we can also recognize the resilience of the women who lived within them. Behind the pearls and pressed dresses were individuals thinking, adapting, dreaming. Behind the etiquette was life messy, nuanced, deeply human. And that is where history truly lives.